So today marks the first day of a Lenten preaching series focused on the 7 deadly sins. So in case you didn't know what those were, that's pride, gluttony, envy, greed, anger, sloth, and lust. So needless to say, this is going to be a fun Lent. I want to start by noting that these specific sins never show up in any kind of a definitive list anywhere in the Bible. Jesus, for example, never preaches to his disciples on the subject of the 7 deadly sins. Paul never writes about 7 deadly sins in his letters. The concept seems to have been slowly developed several centuries later. There are, for example, different versions of these kinds of lists that I think date back to like the 4th century and the 5th century AD. They crop up in various writings from saints and church scholars. The first person, and you might want to fact check me on this, but the first person to have come up with a list of 7 so-called deadly sins was, I believe, St. Gregory, who was a pope in the church. And the list that he produced was actually slightly different from the version that we're probably familiar with, the one that's been codified, I think, in Catholic doctrine. Now, one observation that I made when I was looking through that list is this. None of these sins constitute an outward visible behavior. So you'll notice that, for example, theft doesn't make the list of 7 deadly sins. Stealing doesn't make the list. Murder doesn't make the list. Adultery doesn't make the list. Each of these so-called 7 deadly sins are an inner disposition of the heart that could potentially give birth to outward and visible sins. They're inner dispositions of the heart. So, let's take wrath, for example. Translated sometimes as anger, but I like going with the word wrath for reasons that I'll explain ultimately in a few weeks when I do preach on wrath. But take wrath, for example. Wrath can lead to the outward act of murder, but wrath itself is an inner disposition. Or take envy and covetousness, for example, another deadly sin. That could give birth to the act of stealing. Or the inner disposition of lust, for example, could potentially give birth to the outward act of, say, fornication or adultery. And I'm reminded of something that Jesus once said. The Lord said, "It is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come." So I think one of the reasons why these are called 7 deadly sins maybe is because they are root sins. They're sins that represent the corruption of the heart. They're sins that represent a perversion of our inner being. Now get this. Follow my reasoning here. It could be that among those 7 root sins is one sin that can be described as a root sin. So a single deadly sin that seems to give birth to all of the other ones. Now, St. Augustine of Hippo suggested that's the sin of pride. And that's the deadly sin that I want to zero in on this morning, the sin of pride. The English word pride, of course, covers a pretty broad range of meanings, not all of which are bad. I'll give you an example. A couple weeks ago, my son played on net. He played goalie for his hockey team. And this is me being proud right now. I'm going to brag about my son, but he did really well. So afterwards, our team has something called Player of the Game. So the player of the game gets to wear a construction helmet, and Sammy got to wear this construction helmet. He was just beaming with pride, and it was fantastic. And I remember his coach said to the entire team, he said, "Guys, you played really hard this game, and even though you lost, you tried your best." And everybody kind of applauded. And I could tell the kids felt really proud of themselves. That's a good thing. That's not pride in a negative sense. Or as C.S. Lewis, the Christian author, says, "If the Lord himself declares to you, 'Well done, my good and faithful servant,' you should feel proud about it. You know, you should feel a sense of pleasure that we can call pride as a result of having done something good and pleasing to the Lord." The kind of pride that I'll be talking about today, the kind of pride that can be deemed a deadly sin or a capital sin, has a very specific definition. Pride, when we speak of it as a sin, is the worship of self. That's the technical definition of pride that I want to go with. Pride as the worship of self. Pride as the idolatry of our own ego. So obviously you know the Ten Commandments. The first of the Ten Commandments is, thou shalt have none other gods but me. And when we sin in pride, we violate that particular commandment. Because instead of allowing Christ to reign on the throne of our hearts, instead of allowing Jesus to exercise his sovereign rule over every area of our life, we place ourselves in the Holy of Holies. We make ourselves into our own petty God. And I want you to remember what the serpent says to the first woman when he was trying to tempt her into eating from the tree of knowledge. He says to her, and I quote, "Your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good from evil." That's at the heart of it. Ye shall be as gods. That's what the temptation of pride is all about. It's wanting to be our own God. Now, pride is unlike many so-called deadly sins because it's sneaky. Pride is very, very insidious. Pride can infiltrate its way into our ministries. It can worm its way into our service of Jesus. And I think this might be an especially strong temptation for anyone in church leadership, anyone who's leading church ministry, people who make their work in the church a career. But I think it could be true for realistically anyone else as well. Because a lot of people begin with the best of intentions. We genuinely love Christ. We genuinely care about the poor or those who don't know the gospel. We genuinely care about refugees or children or the environment, whoever, whatever. And we pursue our ministries with this very genuine and very sincere intent. But eventually what happens is this. Eventually what happens is we lose focus on Christ and we lose focus on the people to whom he has called us to serve. And slowly, without taking notice, unresisting and unpraying, we allow ourselves to become the centers of our own ministry, the center of our own work in the church. And it becomes all about us. And as for Jesus, not only is he displaced from the center, not only does he cease to reign in our hearts and in the center of our ministries, but Jesus becomes our tool. He becomes a means to an end for us. He becomes the path to our achieving glory and honor for ourselves. And sadly, this has happened to many, many people in Christian ministry. I want you to take, for example, two men, the two disciples from our gospel reading today. That's James and John, the brothers Zebedee. Jesus gave these two guys what could very well be the coolest nicknames in the entire Bible. Jesus called James and John, get this, the sons of thunder. It sounds like the name of a motorcycle gang, or the sons of thunder. And in today's story, James and John really live up to that nickname. They come to Jesus with perhaps the boldest request anyone has ever made in his presence, but first they make this opening pitch, which is just as bold and arrogant as the request they're ultimately going to make. So here's their opening pitch. They say to Jesus, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." I want you to listen to how many times they use first person plural in that sentence. Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. So they make reference to themselves 3 times in that one sentence. It's all about James and John, isn't it? And to them, Jesus just isn't Lord. He's not Master. Jesus, they use those titles to speak to Jesus. But to them, Jesus is nothing more than a means of achieving their end. Now, what's their end? What's their goal? Well, let's keep going here. So Jesus wisely says in response to the brothers, what do you want me to do for you? And this is how they reply. Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. What do you want? Jesus asks. Oh, nothing, just the two highest positions of power and glory in the entire universe, aside from yours, of course, for eternity, please. And that's a request I think that's worthy of the sons of thunder. And I think if many of us were in Jesus' position, I think we would have fired James and John right there on the spot after giving them a good beating first. But it's amazing, and every time I read this story, I'm surprised at how patient and gentle Jesus is with these incredibly arrogant young men. And I think of how patient and gentle he must be with us in our moments of pride as well. But Jesus says to them, guys, I don't think that you understand exactly what you're asking for. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And what Jesus is saying is, are you willing to give yourself up wholly and completely to the service of God, even to the point of suffering, and even to the point of death? And the boys, I think their reply is a bit naive, it's a bit ignorant, but they say, we are able. And then amazingly, the thing is, Jesus affirms this. I have to say that I don't see any potential in these two disciples right now as I read this story. I look at these guys and I don't think to myself that they're going to be the greatest apostles. I don't think of them as being these great towering figures in church history on the basis of the way they act. But I think Jesus sees something about these two young men that's astonishing. One of the things that John Paul mentioned last week is that James and John and Peter formed the inner circle of Jesus' ministry. James and John were the two disciples along with Peter that he took up on the mountain for the transfiguration. And when Jesus raised that little girl from the dead, James and John and Peter were with him. And I think it's amazing that Jesus sees into their lives and sees their potential. And so what he does now is Jesus looks at them, he looks into their hearts, he perceives their character, and he can even see into their futures. And he says with the utmost seriousness something along the lines of, yes, you will drink from my cup. Yes, you will share in my baptism. But then he adds, but to sit at my right hand or at my left, that's not my call to make. Those seats have already been given to those to whom they were assigned. And that's the opposite of pride. Jesus' response to that request is the very opposite of the worship of self. What Jesus does here is he places his Father's will in the center of his life. He makes the Father the focus of the ministry and says, it's not my call to say who sits at my right and left hand. It's the Father's call. The Father decides this. And he keeps himself in the center of his Father's will. And he will do that throughout the course of his entire ministry to the cross itself. Now, James and John aren't the only disciples who struggle with the sin of pride. It seems as if they all do. All 12 of them. They're jockeying for status. They're elbowing their way to get to the top of that hierarchy. And they're trying to take their places on those two thrones, those two coveted thrones on the right and left side of Jesus. So when they get wind of what the brothers Zebedee have done, the disciples, as the scriptures inform us, begin to be angry with James and John. And Jesus hears them. Maybe he hears them bickering or something like that, or he hears them grumbling against the two brothers. And again, if I were Jesus at this point, I would snap. Because, since chapter 8 of Mark's gospel, Jesus has been trying to drill into his disciples' heads that if they want to follow him, they have to deny themselves. They have to willingly embrace not glory and honor, but suffering and shame and rejection and pain and death. And again, he's made this crystal clear, but the disciples show all kinds of signs that they're just not getting it. It's not sinking in. So with immense patience, Jesus calls his disciples to them. He says, all right, guys, come here again. Come sit with me. And then he delivers the lesson again for like the third or fourth time. Jesus says, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. And what Jesus is saying is this: the rulers of the Gentiles, the leaders of this world, rule in pride. Because I have to say, pride isn't just the sin of wanting to make ourselves our own gods to ourselves. Pride is also the desire to be God over others, to receive from others praise and adoration, to threaten and to bribe and to manipulate and make people pursue our own ends and our own ambitions. And I think that's the way of Alexander the Great. That's the way of Caesar Augustus. That's the way of so many princes and kings and emperors and prime ministers and presidents from the beginning of civilization and up till our time. But listen to what Jesus says next. He says, "But it is not so among you." And when Jesus says those words, "But it is not so among you," what he's doing is he's taking the disciples and he's bracketing them off from the rest of the world. He sets them apart. And what he says to the 12, what he's saying to all of us here today, hearing these words, is he says, "I want you to be different. I want you, my people, to live by an ethic that's different from the rest of the world." And then Jesus goes on to clarify what that ethic is. He says, "Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all." What I think is interesting, one of the many interesting things about this passage anyway, is that Jesus doesn't take the concept of greatness and scrap it and throw it away and say, forget about the word great altogether. What he does is he takes the world's understanding of greatness and he inverts it. He turns it inside out and upside down. Great people in the kingdom of God are those who, instead of worshiping themselves, deny themselves. Great people are those who, instead of using Jesus as a means to achieve their own glorification, like James and John do, and like so many other people do, look to Jesus and say, "He must become greater, I must become less." Great ones are the ones who place God in the center and, instead of serving their own egotistical needs, serve Jesus, serve Him. Now, how do they do that? By serving others self-sacrificially, working towards their well-being and their moral edification, even if in the end nothing is received in return. No power or prestige or possessions or pleasure. And those who live their lives in this way, those who are servants, true servants in this sense, they are the ones who are counted great among the people of God. And of course, the highest example of that humble Christian ethic, the greatest example of self-sacrificial service, is Christ. For the Son of Man, Jesus said, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And that's an example that he has set for all of us, for all of his disciples, for the people of the church. Now, as you all know, we can't possibly give our lives as a ransom for many. I can't die for the sins of the world. You can't die so that humanity might be liberated from sin and death. But if we are followers of the one who did, Jesus, we must be willing to share in his suffering, yes, even to the point of death. Now, for some Christians, that calling to give up life itself for the sake of Jesus Christ and the gospel message has been a literal calling. Church history, of course, knows of many martyrs, men and women who were stoned to death, like St. Stephen, or fed to wild animals, like St. Ignatius, or starved to death in Nazi concentration camps, like Maximilian Kolbe, for the sake of Christ and for the sake of the good news. But the martyrdom that we have been all called to embrace is this: the death of our ego and the extinguishment of our pride, the abandonment of all desire to acquire glory and honor and praise and recognition for ourselves. The martyrdom that we all have to suffer is this: dying to the notion that we can be a God unto ourselves, willingly abdicating all self-rule and surrendering our will to the Father, letting Christ take his rightful place on the throne of our hearts. That's the path out of pride. a life of Christ-centered, God-glorifying, self-sacrificial service. It's a hard path, but at the end of it, and even in places along the way, lies a different kind of greatness. The true greatness to which Jesus calls all of his disciples.